A good hello and welcome to Killer Bites, a spookily cool show on the internet where we discuss true crime cases. Today on Killer Bites, I'm going to tell you about the vanishing of Brandom Swanson. Missing persons cases are always pretty confusing, but this one might go down as the most confusing one I have ever heard. It's about a teenager named Brandon who was driving at night when he got his car stuck in a ditch and tried to walk to the nearby town to meet his parents to pick him up. On his walk, he called his parents to give them updates, but at one point he cursed, the call dropped, and he was never seen again. The worst part about it is that there is literally no clues as to where Brandon is or what happened to him. You think that we can crack this case today? Let's find out. Brandom Swanson was a 19-year-old college student who studied wind energy technology at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota. On May 13, 2008, Brandon had just finished his freshman year. Classes ended that day, so everyone was ready to celebrate the start of summer. That evening, Brandon went to his friend and classmate's house to party in a city of Lind. He drank a little, but wasn't intoxicated like the others. Witnesses reported seeing him take one shot of whiskey, but that was it. At some point that evening, Brandon left the house party and went to another in Canby, which was about a 40-minute drive. And then at midnight, he left that part and headed home. Brandon lived with his parents at the time in Marshall, which was about a 35-minute drive from Canby. But even though that sounds like a lot of driving for Brandon that night, and it was, he was very familiar with his route. It was the same commute he made to and from school all year. The entire trip is a straight shot along State Highway 68. At around 12:30 in the morning, Brandon drove his car into a ditch. Now, I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but my best guess is that he dozed off for a second or something. Brandon tried to get his car unstuck, but his attempts were unsuccessful. He tried calling his friends, but no one was answering, as I'm sure they were all just partying. They're college students, come on. At 1:54 in the morning, Brandon called his parents, Brian and Annette, and told them what had happened. As I'm sure you can imagine, his parents were really freaked out, but Brandon was like, I'm totally fine, the car's okay. Everything's okay, I just need help getting it back up onto the road. Brian and Annette said they would head out ASAP to go help Brandon get the car out of the ditch. Brandon told them that they could find him along the road between Lind and Marshall and gave them some other bits of information to locate him. Brian said based on what his son told him, he believed he was about 10 minutes away from home. But when Brian and Annette made it to that location, they couldn't find Brandon or the car. They called Brandon back and said they were having trouble finding him, so they asked him to keep an eye out for their car in case he spotted them first. Frustrated and nervous, Brian and Annette started honking their horn and flashing their lights to help Brandon find them. They asked Brandon to do the same thing. Again, no luck. They questioned Brandon to see if maybe he'd led them to the wrong area, but he assured them that the information he gave them was correct. And Brian and Annette later reported they knew their son was out partying, but he seemed very coherent and certain of his whereabouts. Well, that's weird. It's almost like Brandon is in this upside down of Stranger Things or another parallel world of sorts. I realize I sound a bit crazy, but hey, anything's possible. Over time, things got heated between the three because they were also frustrated that they couldn't find each other. It was late, they were tired, and they really just wanted to find each other, get Brandon's car out of the ditch and just go home. Brian and Annette kept being like, "Are you sure that this is where you are?" And he was like, "Yes, maybe you're in the wrong place." They kept doubting him, which made him really mad, so he hung up. Annette had that immediate post-abrupt hang-up guilt and called back. She called back. She said that she was sorry and understood her son's frustrations. Everyone calmed down a bit, and Brian felt it would be best to meet them somewhere else because no matter how hard he tried to communicate his location, it didn't seem to work. And that's when he told his parents that he'd walk into the nearby town of Lind and meet them in the parking lot of a bar. Brian and Annette agreed. They got another call with Brandon at 2:23 in the morning. Brandon was walking towards town while Brian and Annette were driving in the same direction as well. But Brandon took some shortcuts and talked through where he was as he walked. He said he was walking on a gravel road and cut through some field, where he walked along a fence towards lights that he assumed came from the town. So he felt he was going in the right direction. He continued to give the play-by-play to his parents before abruptly shouting, "Oh, and dropping the call. Brian and Annette panicked and tried calling him back, but he didn't answer. They rang him several more times, and by the end of the series of phone calls, they started going straight to voicemail, which typically means three things. 1, the phone was dead. 2, The phone was intentionally turned off, or 3, something malfunctioned. Brian and Annette didn't know what to do next. They drove around the area but couldn't really tell where Brandon last was since he cut through that field and wasn't on the main road. The parents looked for Brandon's car at least, but still no luck. They started calling his friends, some of whom came out that night to help the Swansons look for their son. The search party spent the rest of the night looking for Brandon and his car. They checked the bar parking lot just in case Brandon had somehow made it all the way there, but he hadn't. Gosh, it's so strange. Like, where could Brandon be? Why did he scream like that? I mean, I would be nervous if I was his parents. By sunrise, Brian and Annette were tired and hopeless. They were certain something had happened to their son, so it was time to call the authorities. They contacted the Lyon County Sheriff's Department and reported Brandon missing. As it goes with missing persons cases, the cops didn't really pay any mind to Brandon's report. He was an adult who could have gone wherever he wanted that night. Who's to say Brandon didn't just go to another party and maybe spend the night? But Annette and Brian knew their son and knew that this wasn't the case, especially since he called them in the middle of the night to help him. After a few hours, the sheriffs were all like, "Fine, we'll help." Gee, thanks for doing your job. Freaking cops. They did a thorough search of the area and determined what everyone already knew. Brandon wasn't there and neither was his car. So that afternoon, they obtained Brandon's cell phone records to see which tower his phone was pinging off of during his last phone calls. That's when they realized Brandon wasn't near Lind at all. Curveball. He was near the town of Taunton, which was still along the State Highway 68, but it was pretty far from Lind, about 25 miles. To give you more reference information, Taunton was 15-ish miles northwest of Marshall, which is where the Swansons lived. Whoa. So I wonder why Brandon thought he was in Lind. That's really confusing, but it also makes sense as to why he and his parents couldn't find each other. Later in the afternoon on May 14th, Brandon's car was finally located in a ditch right off the side of a gravel road about 1 mile north of the highway. One of the sheriffs reported the vehicle was on a sort of a sharp incline, nothing major, but enough that the car would get hung up so the wheels are too high off the ground to get any sort of traction. And even though the car was in the ditch, there was no visible damage to it, which matched up with Brandon's statements to his parents that he wasn't injured. But where was he then? Investigators scoured the surrounding areas to look for any clues as to where he could have gone. Since the car was in grass and gravel, there was really no way to tell if there were any visible footprints or anything. There were no other pieces of evidence or signs of a struggle from what officials could tell. That seems like a good sign, right? The authorities flew helicopters and brought in a team of search dogs to aid in their efforts of locating Brandon. The dogs followed Brandon's scent all the way to the Yellow Medicine River. This is when the possibility of drowning came into question. The river goes as deep as 15 feet in some parts. So maybe something went wrong and Brandon fell or was forced in the water where he got swept up in the current? I don't know. There was also the possibility that he went into the water and made it to the other side or even traveled downstream, but the dogs weren't able to pick up the scent anywhere else in the area to confirm those theories. So it really started to seem more like Brandon made it to the water and drowned. The next step for investigators was to extensively search the 2-mile stretch of river that he could have traveled down. For a month, officials continued to look along the river on foot, horseback, by air, and any other method that they could, but never found any evidence of Brandon. And to this day, Brandon's whereabouts remain a mystery, and he was yet to be found alive or deceased. How wild is that? Usually with cases like these, there's at least a little bit of evidence to go off of, but nothing. That had to be so frustrating for Brandon's family and the authorities. And how gut-wrenching for the parents who were desperately trying to find Brandon that night. They may have heard his final moments alive. Over time, momentum simmered down in the search for Brandon, at least for the authorities. His family and friends were still doing whatever they could to bring him home. A few searches were coordinated and executed by large groups that spring. And when the fall came around, there was another big group effort coordinated to look for Brandon since the fields had been just harvested. Cadaver dogs were brought out, and they actually caught Brandon's scent, but lost it on a trail and never found anything further. Since this all happened in Minnesota, the winter was brutal, which put the search on hold again. And over the years, people have called in tips and investigators have continued to check the Mud Creek area, which was where the Yellow Medicine River flowed into. The thing that was really difficult in the investigation was honing in on the specific search area. One of the sheriffs on the case summed it up well when he said, "It's a huge area. If you take that immediate area where the car was and then the time frame when he was talking on the phone with his parents, who knows that direction he went and how far he traveled." So here's where we get to the theories. Based on the search dog's scent tracking, the authorities seem to think that Brandon somehow found himself in the water. But since his remains were never recovered, they think that he got out of the water and kept walking. In which direction? It's unclear. But even though it was May, it still got super cold at night in Minnesota. That specific morning, it got to 40 degrees, which means if Brandon was soaked and it was 40 degrees outside, he more than likely passed from hypothermia. But even still, where's his body? How have investigators still not found it after 10 years? This brings us to another theory that Brandon fell into a cistern or tank somewhere. So something notable about Brandon in regards to the case is that he was legally blind in his left eye. He almost always wore glasses, but when he left his car that evening, he also left his glasses behind in the car. In the last few moments on the phone with his parents, Brandon said, "Not another fence," and then, "Oh." One of the sheriffs believes he fell into a tank because it sounded like he was on someone's property, and a lot of landowners in the area had water tanks. And that sounds pretty legit, but I wonder if they tried contacting anyone in the area to search for tanks and potentially look into them. At this point in the investigation, you would think that detectives would have already tried this. And based on the way that his phone rang for the first few calls and then went to voicemail, that wouldn't quite match up with the idea that Brandon fell in the water right after he cursed. If that were the case, his phone would have immediately gone dead. So, on to the next theory we go. So this one involves Brandon getting hit by a car. Some case followers think that someone accidentally hit him while he was walking and they panicked and hit his body. But there were no signs of a struggle along the road that investigators could see, and based on his last phone call, he wasn't even on a road. He was all up in them fields, which was also confirmed by his cell phone records and the search dog's findings. Also, I feel like that would be a lot for a driver to coordinate removing and hiding a body in the middle of the night without leaving any tire marks, vital fluid, or anything. Theory number 4 is that Brandon staged his own disappearance. We're really getting desperate here, but again, we're trying anything. To me, and most people, it seems a bit whack for Brandon to call his parents for help and then ditch them like that. But he was on the phone with them for over an hour, talking through his every move. Why would he do that if he was trying to run away? Yeah. Brandon was a good student. He had a good relationship with his parents and never been in any legal trouble. He wasn't really in a situation where he needed to run away from someone like the cops. So this theory, like all the others, seem highly unlikely, but we'll never know what he truly was going through. Maybe he had an internal struggle that we didn't know about, or he wanted to start fresh, or he had some other reasons to want to get away. Okay, so then what about this screams foul play? Did someone abduct or slay Brandon? Based on the few facts that we know about the situation, there aren't any true signs of foul play. This all happened in a rural town with a very small population. There didn't seem to be anyone who wanted to go after Brandon. And on top of all that, Brandon really did get his car stuck in the ditch. And how could the possible perp predict something like that? Maybe there was a trap set up that we don't know about. And on the other hand, it could all have been just a spur-of-the-moment thing. There could have been a local or out-of-town driver driving down the road who saw Brandon walking alone in the dark and thought, "I've always wanted to kill somebody. Now is my time to shine." As sick as it is, we have covered several cases where the perps just kill for fun or they just want to know what it's like. But in general, the residents and case followers don't believe this theory whatsoever. There's just too much about it that doesn't make sense with the circumstances. Yeah, I feel like none of these theories add up for me, but for some inexplicable reason, Brandon vanished off the face of the earth with no trace. No signs of foul play, no DNA evidence, no tire tracks, nothing. That sounds like a textbook alien abduction to me. It would explain all the confusing elements to this case, and that, my friends, is all I ask for. Answers that make sense. I mean, what do you think happened to Brandon? I just want to hear your take on this story, and with your help, maybe this case can finally come to a resolution, because right now, it has an extremely unsatisfying ending. Guys, thank you so much for watching another episode of Killer Bites. My name is Mack, and we will catch you on the next episode. Stay safe, my friends.